Hello again. So this is module 2.4. We'll talk about external influences. So in this section, we're going to be going through some other explanations for why some countries are underdeveloped. So we'll take a look at adverse geography, disease, colonial legacies, the influence of international organizations, and then we'll conclude by looking at whether or not developing countries are catching up to developed countries. So to start off, let's take a look at this is a heat map sort of the world, pun intended, I suppose. Basically, countries are shaded a color based off of how rich they are, basically their GDP per capita. So the darker blue countries are richer. So here you see, like for example, the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Japan. And then the more red a country is, the poorer they are. So, like for example, here we've got the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, Niger. Oh, went too far. You can see here that if we take a look at where sort of the red countries are sort of centered, you can see that they're pretty close to the equator. And so this begs the question, what is it about having a tropical climate that might lead towards underdevelopment in a country? So you see kind of the further away we move from the equator, it looks like income goes up. The closer we are to the equator, income goes down. So there's a number of different explanations for this. And one of them is maybe that just people are less productive in hotter climates, right? So, maybe it's simply that, they're hotter and this has an impact on your productivity. And there's a little bit of credence to this argument. So there was a study done by Ellsworth Huntington way back in 1915 that took a look at productivity across a range of different temperatures. And so basically you see here temperatures ranging from 15 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And he's looking at a number of different things. So, for example, A is 300 men in two Connecticut factories. You have girls in one Connecticut factory. You got people in Denmark, cigar makers in Tampa, Florida, so on and so forth. And what you see here is that productivity looks like it sort of peaks, somewhere around between 60 and 70 degrees. And once you kind of get over 70 degrees, you start to see productivity going down. So it looks like there might be a little bit of evidence that, people are not very productive when it's freezing cold and they're not very productive when it's very hot. And this last one right here, basically, this is sort of standard deviations from the mean in terms of average temperatures. And what you see here is that, temperature, then sort of standard deviations from the mean in terms of productivity. Sorry. And you can see here that, students tend to be doing better when it's not super hot. As the temperature goes up, people tend to do a lot worse. Okay. Now, that was really old data. You might be saying, well, now we have air conditioning and things like that. So a more modern study that was taking a look at productivity in Indian manufacturing plants, where there's probably not actually air conditioning in a lot of these. This was done in 2013, and what you see here is that basically these are the estimates of sort of changes in productivity based on temperature, and you can see that, so here's zero. These little bars here represent the 95% confidence intervals. And really, it's only when temperatures get above 25 degrees Celsius, which is pretty warm. So basically, what do? You add 32 and you roughly double it. So we're talking like 80 plus degrees. And so this is really the only situation where we see a drop, a statistically significant drop in temperature, is when the temperature gets too hot. So I think there's a little bit of credence to that, certainly in developing poor countries where there's not a lot of air conditioning. When it is hot, you're not as productive. That being said, I think that's really a minor component to, sort of why it is that countries in developing countries in tropical regions. Sorry, let me backtrack here. I think the fact that people are less productive when it's hot is a pretty minor reason why tropical countries, on average, tend to have lower incomes. I think disease is a much bigger component of this. And so we tend to observe a lot more disease in tropical climates than we do in more temperate climates. Especially we see things like malaria, a lot of parasitic infections that, you don't observe nearly as much in, sort of colder climates. And so why does this matter? So it matters today, certainly. If there's more endemic disease, what you might have a situation is a lot of, very young children might get infected, with a parasitic infection. Now, this won't necessarily kill them, but what it does is it reduces their nutritional intake, right? So if you have, schistosomiasis or GRD or some other kind of, tropical parasitic infection, what effectively that does is it makes you lose nutrients. I mean, basically you spew out of every orifice. And Sorry, gross, I know. But essentially, what's going on is if you're very young, you're not going to get the same kind of nutritional intake if you didn't have that disease. Now, why that matters is that those first 5 years of your life are critically important in terms of your physical development and maybe even more importantly, your cognitive development. And if you face a nutritional deficiency in those early years, you're not going to reach your full genetic potential, certainly for your cognitive ability. And that can have a lifelong impact on somebody's productivity. So that's the impact of disease today. Now, there's a really interesting study that was done by Asamoglu, Johnson, and Robinson in 2001 that looked at a link between disease during the colonial era and the kind of economic institutions that a country has today. So basically, their argument is that during the colonial era, so here we're talking 16, 17, 1800s kind of, there was, this is sort of the age of colonialism. A lot of European countries were establishing colonies in Latin America and Sub Saharan Africa and Asia. And some of those places got long term European settlement. Other places had very little settlement. And a big reason for that was that there was a lot of endemic disease. So a lot of settlers moved to a place like Mali, for example, and they died off at tremendous rates. And so a country like Mali that had a lot of endemic disease never got long term settlement. And so the colonizing power basically had an arm's length relationship with that area. It sort of treated it as a resource to be exploited. And it set up what were known as extractive colonial institutions. And a lot of the times, the institutions that a country had at the time of its independence are still the institutions that it has today. We're going to talk about why in a minute. But first, let's go over what I mean when I say economic institutions. So institutions are basically the set of structures, mechanisms, sort of the rules of the game that organize economic activity in a country. And so some examples are things like property rights, transparency, economic mobility, trust in government, lack of discrimination, a fair and equitable legal system. These are all really important examples of good institutions. So if you don't have strongly defined property rights that define, who owns what, both in terms of physical property and also in terms of intellectual property, then you're not going to have people willing to make long-term investments, right? So why would I, pour my money, my effort, my blood, sweat, and tears into building a business if I think the government's just going to take it as soon as it becomes profitable, right? So that's an example of weak property rights, and I'm not willing to make that kind of entrepreneurial venture if the property rights are not strong, right? If I don't have good, strong intellectual property rights, then I'm not going to be willing to develop, some, new, form of software or some new medical technology if somebody's going to be able to copy it right afterwards. And so that's critically important, right? Economic mobility, right? The fact, economic mobility basically refers to it doesn't matter, what sort of situation you're born into. You could be born, super poor with zero advantages, but if you work hard and you're productive and you put forth the effort, there's nothing that's going to stop you from increasing your income, increasing your socioeconomic status, right? Now, if you don't have economic mobility, if you have a situation where the situation you're born into puts up a whole bunch of barriers that are preventing you from rising up and reaching your full potential, then that's going to limit a lot of incentive for people to get educations to work harder. Trust in government is critically important, right? So this is something like, for example, you go to a restaurant, you see that health grade A in the window. You trust that the government health inspector is honest and that if you eat at that restaurant, you're not going to get sick. Now, if you didn't trust the government, if you thought that the health inspectors were, rampantly corrupt and open to bribery, you wouldn't put any faith in, that A that's in the window there. And you're more likely to not want to eat at that restaurant because you don't know if it's going to make you sick or not, right? So that's critically important, right? So you fly in an airplane, you assume that, the FAA in the US or whatever organization it is in other countries, is doing a good job of making sure that those planes are safe, right? That it's not going to take off if it's has something seriously wrong with it. That the air traffic control system has experienced and qualified people that are working there, right? We're assuming all of this. This is trust not just in government but in the market. If you didn't have that trust, then of course you're less willing to take those sorts of risks. Discrimination, for example. If you had an employer that refused to hire anybody unless they were, I don't know, above 6'5" or whatever like that. Well, they are, if there's not a good reason for doing that, then they're shrinking their pool of available labor. That's going to raise labor costs. And it certainly limits the ability of a country to harness its full economic potential, right? So the next, Bill Gates, the next, Steve Jobs, whatever, the next huge entrepreneur that's really going to make this, big push forward, in producing, in driving forward that a country's economy, there's no guarantee that that person was born into, wealth and privilege, right? That next great entrepreneur, that next great thinker might be born into, a terribly poor country with, or terribly poor family with no opportunities whatsoever. They may be part of a marginalized racial minority, right? And we want that person to have every single opportunity to realize their full potential, because if they do, then the country prospers. And so these are all examples of the kinds of institutions that lead to more economic prosperity. Now, if you think about a colonizing power that wants to extract as much out of a colony as it can, it wants to take as many resources as it can, well, it doesn't want to have that. It wants to have really weak property rights because it wants to be able to go in and sort of take those resources away from people. It's not going to be very transparent because it doesn't want people to know, some of the atrocities that it's committing. It does not want economic mobility because if you've got a elite minority ruling over a subjugated majority, you don't want that subjugated majority to be able to rise up. There's not going to be a lot of trust in government because government's there basically to exploit you. There's certainly a lot of discrimination that's there. There's certainly not, a legal system that is equal to everybody if you have, again, that elite colonizing power that's ruling over a subjugated indigenous population. So basically the argument that Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson are making is that you have some colonies that had relatively low settler mortality rates. So think of the U.S., for example. And so Europeans moved to the U.S. and they pushed for institutions that mirrored those of the colonizing power, the UK in this example. So the settlers there were demanding strong property rights to protect their own small claims. And if you think about, what was, the American Revolution fought over, one of the, big slogans, no taxation without representation. And that's basically, a push for strong property rights, right? I mean, arbitrary and capricious taxation is an example of weak property rights. If a settlement starts to prosper, it draws in more settlers, and that increases their political influence with the colonizing power. However, if there's an area that has really high settler mortality rates, then again, the colonizing power has an arm's length relationship with that colony. And so the colonizers are going to set up big, huge state owned monopolies to extract resources. They're going to try to consolidate power by forming, institutions that are taking away from those subjugated indigenous populations. And oftentimes, they were just sort of leaving the day to day operations to a small domestic elite group that was there. So here's some examples of extractive colonial institutions. So a French training manual for colonial governors at the time basically had this quote: "The European commandant is not posted to observe nature. He has a mission to impose regulations, to limit individual liberties, to collect taxes." Now, I mean, can you imagine if this was basically the charge of the elected officials that we have in our country, right? I mean, people would go crazy over that. But basically, this is clear that the person that is in charge there, they are not there for the betterment of the country or the colony that they're located in. They are there to extract as many resources and send it back to the colonizing power. Some other examples of this. So about half of total production in modern day Benin was sent to France. So not reinvested in the country, but basically half of the total income that was produced in that place was essentially hauled back to the colonizing power of France. Britain, for example, only reinvested about 6% of the taxes it collected from modern day Zambia. So 94% of them were going back straight to the UK. Tunisia, which used to be a former French colony, basically tax rates in Tunisia were 4 times higher than they were in France. So those are just a couple of examples of these really extractive institutions that were set up in these colonies, a lot of which had really high settler mortality rates. Now, why do we care about what happened in the colonial era? Is that oftentimes the institutions that were set up during the colonial era are still the institutions that we have today. So a number of reasons for this. First, there's really high fixed costs to change institutions, right? Anytime you want to change the way that things are going, you are going to have to exert a tremendous amount of effort, right? So, I mean, just think about in the US, when we're trying to reform healthcare, for example, there's so many vested interests that are opposed to making these kinds of changes. It's unbelievably costly to do it. And a lot of times developing countries that don't have a lot of surplus income really just simply don't have the means to do so. Now, perhaps more importantly, is that those who have the power to change institutions oftentimes have zero interest in doing so. So if you think about, an authoritarian state, so a former colony gains independence and maybe there's some populist revolution, but usually whoever took over is not necessarily taken over as an open and free democracy. They generally run fairly authoritarian states, and an authoritarian state benefits from the kind of extractive institutions that were set up during the colonial era. This allows a small group of elites to rule over a subjugated majority. And so those small group of elites, they have no interest in increasing property rights. They have no increasing interest in improving transparency or allowing for more economic and social mobility, because doing those things threatens their positions of power. And then finally, what we oftentimes do see is that investment, especially foreign investment into a country, is complementary to the kind of institutions that they have. And if you were to change institutions, you run the risk of losing that investment. So, a simple example is a country basically offers a foreign investor a huge tax break if they set up operations in their country. Well, to give a lower tax rate to a foreign investor than you give to domestic firms, that's an example of weak property rights. Basically, you are, giving different rules of the game to different people. And if you were to reform that and you were to give everybody the exact same taxes, well, you might lose that foreign investment. Or, for example, if you let a foreign investor, violate any kind of pollution regulations you have in a country because you want that money, if you were to, again, treat everybody the same, you might lose that foreign investment. And a lot of countries are really hesitant to do so. So, the upshot of all of this is that oftentimes the institutions that a country had at independence are still the institutions they have today. Not every case, but we do observe a lot of this. So, to show you some data on this, so this is basically this first column, this is the settler mortality rate. So, this is basically what fraction of settlers that moved to one of these now countries, at the time colonies, were dying. And so you look at places like Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, the US, South Africa, and Canada, below 2%. So pretty low mortality rates among settlers. You take a look at some of these other places. Cote d'Ivoire has like a 40% settler mortality rate, all the way up to Mali, where, 3 out of every 4 settlers basically were dying of endemic diseases that was there. Now, what we have in the second column is the current measure of property rights. So this is not the colonial measure, but this is their property rights right now. And so essentially it's measured as protection from expropriation. Expropriation essentially is when the government takes your stuff. And so it's on a 10-point scale. The higher you are, closer you are to 10, the stronger the property rights in a country. And what you see is, by and large, these countries that have low settler mortality in the colonial era have really strong property rights today. Whereas those places that had really high mortality rates, on average, have much worse property rights today. And so it seems like there's a little bit of evidence of the link between colonial settler mortality and modern day institutions. There's some exceptions here and there. South Africa has relatively lower property rights compared to the rest of this group. Gambia has relatively higher property rights. But then if we look at that third column, we can see that it's pretty clear that the countries that have the lowest settler mortality rates, the best property rights, also on average have higher incomes than those that had high settler mortality and now low property rates. Okay, so the next thing we'll take a look at is the influence of international organizations. So here we're talking about things like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and we're going to come back to this in the very last module when we talk about financing international development. But for now, really, it appears that these organizations have not always acted in the best interests of poor countries. They're pretty heavily influenced by rich countries, and a lot of people have argued that if you look at the policies that they do, they oftentimes benefit rich countries at the expense of poor countries. So World Trade Organization rules oftentimes have protected agricultural subsidies in developed countries. Now, why this matters is that you have, subsidies, for example, in the U.S. to corn growers that have made it so cheap for those growers basically to grow corn that they then export their corn to poor countries in Latin America, for example, and are able to undercut the prices of domestic producers, even though, these poor countries have such low labor costs. That, this is essentially an example where you're not just helping out the farmers for the local markets, you're actually, hurting farmers in developing countries with these subsidies. Another example, the IMF essentially works like a big, credit union, essentially, in countries, put money in, and they are allowed essentially to borrow up to 3 times as much as they've sort of put in as their quota. But they're borrowing, right? They're not. This is not a grant. The IMF is not just giving you money. So if you get into a financial crisis, You can turn to the IMF for a bailout to cover your current debts, but they want to get paid back. And oftentimes, the bailout packages that they offer come with, well, they always come with essentially strings attached. And there's things that you have to do in order to get, successive rounds of financing from the IMF. So you need to privatize industries, you need to cut debt, you need to raise taxes, you need to, devalue your exchange rate if you're doing that. Now, all of these things are, certainly consistent with a country being able to pay their debts back, but they all have negative impacts on the economy. So if you are, cutting debt, that means you got to cut government spending. Somebody's going to be hurt by that. If you're privatizing a state-owned industry, one of the first things that a private for-profit, company is going to do is going to cut labor costs by getting, reducing their employment. Again, these are important and they're beneficial in the long run, but in the short run, there's tremendous economic pain. If you devalue your currency, sure, that's going to help you out. It's going to let you export more. But a devalued currency is going to raise the cost of all imports in the country, and especially developing countries. They import a lot of finished goods. And so you are magnifying the cost of living for people in those countries. And so, a lot of times the IMF is, focused on making sure that they're not sending good money after bad. And sure, that's important. You don't want to bail somebody out and then just have them get into a debt crisis all over again. But at the same time, you are engaging in just, you're exerting tremendous economic pain on those countries in the short run. And in fact, the rich countries that basically run the IMF don't follow the prescriptions that the IMF would advocate. So back in 2008, during the financial crisis, the U.S. was on a lot of debt. Other European countries were in a lot of debt, and we didn't, raise taxes. We didn't cut government spending. In fact, we did the exact opposite. We increased government spending, we cut taxes, and we did exactly the opposite of what the IMF would have demanded of us had we been a developing country seeking a loan from them. So, there's a little bit of hypocrisy in terms of how the IMF is run. Now, if we take a look at, sort of there's an argument the IMF is run by rich countries for rich countries. Well, it is certainly run by rich countries. Whether or not it's run for rich countries is something we'll come back to. But basically, the way that voting at the IMF works is you essentially have votes proportional to how much you contribute, right? So, the U.S. has a quota here of $112 billion. That's 17.5% of the total quota, and that gives them 17.5% of all the votes. By themselves, the U.S. can block any change to the IMF's bylaws. You need a supermajority of 85% of votes to change the way that the IMF operates, and the U.S. alone can basically veto any kind of changes. And so if you look here, for example, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, sort of the richest countries in the world, 35 countries, 17% of world population, they hold 65% of the votes at the IMF. Non-OECD countries, 154 countries, 83% of the world's population has 35% of the IMF's votes. So what you have is an organization in which there is not representation proportional to population, rather it's representation proportional to income. So the vast majority of the world's population is underrepresented at the IMF in terms of voting power. So that's, something to consider is that international organizations have not always acted in the best interests of developing countries. Okay, so the last thing we'll take a look at here is the question of whether or not developing countries are catching up. So there's a couple of reasons why we might expect them to be. And so first off, there is the theory of diminishing returns to capital. The idea basically here is that capital is going to have its highest return where it's the most scarce, right? So if you're choosing to invest in a country that has abundant capital, you're going to have a pretty low return because there's already a lot of capital there. However, you could invest in a country that capital is really scarce, and theoretically, all else being equal, it should have a really high return there. And so the theory basically says that we should observe capital flowing from rich countries where it's abundant to poor countries where it's scarce and has a higher return, and these capital infusions should accelerate growth. Now, I mentioned earlier all else being equal. Of course, not all else is being equal. There's a whole bunch of other reasons why capital might have a lower return in a developing country, even if it's scarce. Things like less human capital, bad institutions, all the stuff we've been talking about in this module and the previous one. Something we'll come back to. Certainly in Module 4, we go over growth theory. The second reason why we might expect developing countries to catch up is the notion of technology transfer. So there's a whole bunch of existing technologies out there that developing countries could adopt, right? They don't need to reinvent the wheel. They can adopt these existing technologies and bypass stages of development because they don't need to go through the process of creating the technologies that currently rich countries did. Uh, Again, we need to think back to the previous module and remember that a lot of the technologies that are out there are developed to address issues in rich countries. So, for example, we want to replace relatively scarce labor with abundant capital. So, automation works great in a country. Sorry, doesn't necessarily work great for everybody in that country, but if you want to sort of maximize growth, then a process like automation is effective in a country that has abundant capital and scarce labor. But a lot of developing countries have scarce capital and abundant labor, and automation just doesn't make any sense. So, given sort of those two caveats that I talked about, it's not surprising that we have almost no evidence of what we call unconditional economic convergence. So, unconditional convergence basically is if we look at countries, for example, based on their income in 1970, and we then do a scatter plot of their starting income in 1970 against their average annualized growth rates in real GNI per capita between 1970, in this case 2010, so that 40-year period, what we observe here is basically zero relationship. There's not a positive slope, there's not a negative slope. Basically, it doesn't look like poor countries are catching up to rich countries. If poor countries were catching up to rich countries, then we'd see a negative slope here where the poorest countries would have the highest growth rates. And, you can kind of think, oh, maybe it looks like there's a little bit of this that's there. But if you actually were to fit the best fit line to this, it's this sort of, basically there's no line whatsoever. It's essentially that blue line that's right there. But there is, however, some evidence of what we call conditional convergence. Conditional convergence basically means that if we first condition on a variable or even a set of variables, then we might observe within groupings of countries that are sort of connected based on that conditioning variable, we might observe that poorer countries are growing faster than richer countries within that group, right? So, for example, if we group countries together by geography, right? So we might observe within a particular geographic region where you do have more sort of similarities between countries, then the countries that start off poor might grow faster than the countries that start off rich. You could group them by the kind of political system they have, democracies versus more authoritarian states, their colonial history, the quality of institutions, the levels of human capital, initial development levels. And you're not restricted to, just conditioning on one variable. You can condition on all of them. But of course, the more variables you're conditioning on, sort of the more hyper-specific convergence is going to be. So I went ahead and I just conditioned on geographic region. And so what we observe is that when we do condition on geography, we find some pretty decent evidence of convergence. So for example, if I'm just looking at East Asian countries, then I see a pretty strongly significant negative slope here between initial income and growth rates. So the countries that started off the poorest, for example, China, have had the fastest growth rates. The countries that have started off the richest have on average had the lowest growth rates. Same thing holds if we look at the Middle East and North Africa. The countries that started off the poorest have grown faster than the countries that have started off the richest. Same thing holds in Latin America. We see, again, the countries that started off poor have grown at faster rates than the countries that have started off rich. It falls apart if we take a look at sub-Saharan Africa, where basically we find no evidence that's there. And so we would need to look at a different conditioning variable for these sub-Saharan African countries. Maybe group resource-dependent countries versus non-resource-dependent countries, or colonial histories, a whole bunch of things we could look at there. But simple geography doesn't hold there. So anyways, that's the end of this section. We just wanted to take a look there. So the big conclusions from this section are that geography matters. And it matters for a number of reasons. One, there's a little bit of evidence that people are less productive in hotter climates, but disease is much more important. So current disease, especially when it affects children, can affect their cognitive development, impacting productivity for the long run. But then also there's a link between a country's colonial history and its disease environment. Countries that had a lot of disease got very little long-term European settlement and got extractive colonial institutions from their colonizing power. And these extractive institutions have persisted until today. International organizations have not always acted in the best interests of these countries. And then finally, we don't see any evidence of unconditional economic convergence, but we do see some evidence if we group countries based off of common characteristics. So in this example, geography. Okay, so that concludes Module 2. We will have a quiz on Tuesday, June 2nd, covering Modules 1 and 2. I encourage you go through the practice quizzes at the end of modules 1 and 2. That's a good sort of preparation for the actual quiz that's going to take place on Tuesday. It's going to be some multiple choice, some free response, but nothing that you haven't seen in either these videos or in the notes. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to set up a Zoom conference call. We can do some office hours. Other than that, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day.